When we speak of concentration camps, we usually think of piles of dead bodies, of the crematorium of Auschwitz. We think of the Holocaust. Concentration camps were much more than that. They were the main instrument of terror of the Nazi state, of the Nazis. They were founded, the first one was founded in 1933. Dachau was the first concentration camp. And basically, very soon after the establishment of a camp system, the Nazis, in particular the SS, which was running the camp system, was actually thinking of using prisoners in production sites and making money out of them. So the idea of slave labor became essential for the concentration camps, and it was also one method of punishment. But on the other hand side, slave labor also had to be efficient for the Nazis, for the SS, because the SS was planning to have the concentration camp to become the slave labor in the concentration camp become the backbone of their enterprises, of their economic enterprises. The SS had a very big empire of companies, and the idea was to, and they used it actually, they used this empire to finance their own project, and Himmler always had the idea, the vision, to be financially independent because of his big enterprise and slave labor from the Nazi state, and so have more power in the Nazi state. Now, one of the subjects which was ignored by historians for a very long time was the subject of camp brothels. Camp brothels were built in concentration camps from 1942 on, 10 of them actually, and these camp brothels were a way to boost productivity in the camps. As ridiculous as it sounds, Heinrich Himmler thought if we could just have the incentive of sexuality, male prisoners would work harder. And therefore, instead of like 30% of their productivity, they will arrive at 100% of their productivity. And so he introduced brothels in concentration camps together with other incentives. So prisoners could buy cigarettes in the camp canteen for special vouchers they would receive for better work. With those vouchers, they could also buy a certain kind of food in some canteen. But also they could visit a brothel. So 10 brothels were built in the entire camp system. We had Dachau, we had Buchenwald, we had Neuengamme, we had Sachsenhausen, we had Mittelbau-Dora, we had Auschwitz I and Auschwitz II. So, and these camps actually, usually women were brought to these camps who were prisoners themselves, usually prisoners from Ravensbrück concentration camp. And we know today that those women were mostly German women, some were Polish or Eastern European. And the reason why they had German and Eastern European or Polish women and not Jewish women, as everybody would think, was because the prisoners who were allowed to go to the brothel were also German prisoners and Polish prisoners and Eastern European prisoners. Jews were always a minority in the camp system. We forget this because we think of the Holocaust, it's the killing of the European Jews, but in the camp system itself, most of the prisoners were actually Polish prisoners. They were the vast majority. So women actually had to match the national background or the ethnic background of the person who visited the brothel because of the race laws, simply. Now, we know about 210 women were all together in these 10 brothels. And these 210 women mostly survived the concentration camp system. But after the war, obviously, talked very little about what had happened in actually the camps. Now, the subject of concentration camp brothels was a big taboo for many years, in East and in West Germany as well. Partly because it had to do that only a minority of the camp prisoners, always less than 1% of the camp population, would ever consider to go to the brothel. Also because the narrative and the memory of the concentration camp was pretty much political. And it was political on both sides of the Iron Curtain, on East and West Germany. Political prisoners in the West, established from the 50s on, the first memorials in the 60s, and Dachau became the central memorial in Western Germany. It was a long battle, and it was a fight for recognition and acceptance as victims of the Nazi states. Now that battle had to be fought with a very clear language, and difficult subjects like as the gray zone, capos who were working for the SS, helped prisoners, but also killed other prisoners, or even the brothel, were subjects which were kind of eliminated from the very clear narrative. The situation in the eastern part was very different, because in the eastern part of Germany, in the GDR, the narrative of the concentration camp prisoners and the survivor was strongly linked to the narrative of the communists resisting to the Nazi state. Now, East Germany used a certain situation, part of the history of the Buchenwald concentration camp, which was the biggest, actually. Buchenwald was the biggest concentration camp on German soil. Auschwitz, the biggest one in general, but Buchenwald, the one on German soil. Established in 1937 already for 8,000 prisoners. But actually in 1944, we had already 43,000 prisoners in Buchenwald and the sub-camps of Buchenwald. So you see, it was a very big camp. Now, there was a situation that in Buchenwald, the former prisoners or the prisoners inside of the camp were many communists, organized German communists, members of the Communist Party. They actually were brought to a concentration camp in 1933 already, so right after the takeover of the Nazis, and then actually passed through different kind of camps and then ended up in Buchenwald. And in Buchenwald, they managed to get into a higher position of the camp organization, like capo position, block elder. They worked in the Schreibstube, in the let's call it the administration. They worked in the camp hospital, and this way could manage to organize extra food, could put prisoners they wanted to protect in like safer squads, and so on. The resistance movement in Buchenwald was under the leadership of the communists, of the German communists, and they actually managed to establish a very good organization that actually led in 1945 and on April 10th, actually, to the case that there was a collective disobedience to order of the SS, which I know has never happened before in any camp. The entire camp was ordered to appear on a roll call, and they wanted to evacuate, and the camp had put them on death marches because the Allies were coming closer, the Americans. But instead, they refused the order and said, nope, we stay indoors, we don't leave the barracks. And this is the first act of civil disobedience, which actually saved thousands of lives because the SS could not evacuate the camp. Now, a day later, when the Americans were just about to arrive at the camp, the prisoners took possession of the camp. They went on the guard towers, overthrew the guards, and arrested them. And so when the Americans arrived, the prisoners opened the door and says, welcome our liberators, even though they had already liberated themselves. Now, this is very important for the East German narrative, or for the East German history, because East Germany defined itself as an anti-fascist state. The narrative of Buchenwald is very important because what happened is, through Buchenwald, it is shown that under the leadership of the German communists, Germans, with the help of the Allies, liberated themselves from the Nazis. And now East Germany is the new anti-fascist state. And in this anti-fascist state, there are no Nazis, obviously, because they all fled to West Germany. And now, with the memory of Buchenwald, we always are remembered that our ancestors, like the German communists, some of them were killed, and others managed to survive and overthrew the Nazis. So it is partly true, because after that, many of the prisoners of Buchenwald who were communists actually were in higher position of the East German state. Ernst Busse, that I will refer to the name later on, he actually in fact became the prime minister of Thuringia, which was one of the German federal states, and I was in a federal state in Eastern Germany. He was later on killed in a gulag, but that's a different story. And Busse actually was one of the key figures in the movement, in the anti-fascist, in the resistance movement inside of Buchenwald. Now, what happened is, when in 1943, the Nazis established a brothel in Buchenwald, many of the prisoners had never seen women in 10 years. Because in 1933, they were brought to a concentration camp. Men were isolated from women, and there was no way to get in contact with the other gender. So it was a kind of a big event when the brothel opened, because those men had never seen women in many years. So the communist organization, the resistance organization in the camp finds out about it. They're building a barrack, and it becomes a brothel, and so they wanted to know why the SS does it, and the SS says because we wanted to increase the productivity. But the prisoner think, well, it's bullshit. How can that create a boost in productivity of a camp? Now, what then happened is the prisoners, the communist prisoners, get together in a legal meeting and decide we're going to boycott the brothel. That means we're going to talk to people who wanted to visit the brothel and try to convince them not to go there, because the women are not doing this voluntarily, so they don't want to be subject or object or perpetrators of sexual violence. Also, they were afraid that the Nazis would use the brothel to spy on the illegal resistance organization. And also, like, a communist generally doesn't do that. He doesn't go to the brothel. Prostitution is against the idea of communism. So basically, that was a no-go. They placed also prisoners like right at the entrance of the brothel. So if they saw some communist comrade passing by, they would try to say, "Listen, don't go here because we had the order, or we decided not to do this." Now, Erich Reschke. Reschke was the camp elder, which is the highest ranked prisoner inside of Buchenwald. So we had on one hand side the SS, and the SS was the highest person in charge of the camp, was the as the leader, and then the camp elder is on the other side, on the camp side, the highest ranked prisoner. Reschke, he was ordered by the SS to open the brothel. So when it opened in July 1943, he, as a highest ranked prisoner, was supposed to go there, and he refused. He said, "I'm not going. I'm not doing this. My political beliefs are against it." The SS said, "Well, if you don't do it, we're going to put you out of your position and put someone from maybe an antisocial or criminal prisoner in that position, which would have been devastating for the resistance movement." So he obeyed the order. Also, there was, I already talked about Ernst Busse. Ernst Busse, he was the head, one of the two heads of the resistance movement. Reschke was one and Busse was the other one. And he actually was a great lover of the brothel. He fell in love with a woman there. And he actually had her sleep in his own private cell or private room in the camp hospital, because Busse was the head, the prisoner head, the capo of the camp hospital. And because he was in that position, he was very important for the resistance organization, because there were wards, for instance, tuberculosis wards or typhus wards, where the SS would never go because they were afraid of diseases like typhus, for instance. And so that was a perfect hiding place for, if they wanted to hide someone from the SS. Now, so after World War II, this became a problem. Because Ernst Busse, he became prime minister of the, I said prime minister, he actually was the minister of interior of the state of Thuringia. I have to correct this, sorry. And Busse actually, the story was known, well, everybody knew in the camp from the communist resistance, that Busse was a lover of the brothel. Now, that was a problem. So when the memorials of Buchenwald was founded after the war, it became essential for the narrative of World War II and of the resistance of the communists. And so obviously the story of the brothel was ignored. There were writings, books published on Buchenwald. For instance, there was the book by Eugen Kogon. And Eugen Kogon, in this book called The SS State, he talks about the entire organization of Buchenwald. It's a very good book, actually. And he actually dedicates an entire chapter to the subject of the brothel. But in East Germany, the subject was entirely ignored, because obviously it would cast a very, very bad light on the communists, on the resistance movement in Buchenwald. Now, what then happened is the subject was ignored, but obviously some people who were visitors who knew Kogan's book, passed by through a tour, and then would pass by the camp. The infirmary, the camp hospital, and next to the camp hospital was the former brothel. And here they are, standing at the brothel, asking questions to the guides, and the guides can't answer because they've never heard about the subject. So now the administration of the memorial kind of decides we're going to have a commission and investigate on the subject of the brothel. They get survivors together and write 8 pages dossier, like a paper on the brothel, in which they explain that the Nazis tried to spy on the communists resisted to it, we tried to help the women, and we were good, and nothing ever bad happened, and that's it. So they didn't talk about Busse. They didn't talk about communists wanting to go to the brothel. So that was also taken out of this this paper. And this paper was locked in a actually in one of these they call it the poison cabinets, so that's where the stuff is locked, which nobody's supposed to see. So the guides and the administration people and the people working in Buchenwald had to know about the subject in case they were asked, but they were also told never to talk individually about the brothel. So the subject was then ignored continuously. So after the fall of communism, and finally, the archives were opened, and also this paper was found, and so we know today that there was an order given by the communist administration of the memorial to not talk about the brothel. That is the case in Buchenwald, but we also know that in other cases, the story was a bit different. The narrative was whitewashed in the case of Buchenwald, because Buchenwald was the essential, the founding myth of the East German communist state, the so-called communist state. Nearby Buchenwald was the camp of Mittelbau-Dora. And Mittelbau-Dora was famous for the production of the V2 and V1 missiles underground. Werner von Braun, he was working there before he was taken by the Americans and became the head of the Apollo project. And they were carving these massive tunnels into in the mountain to build these missiles underground. And thousands of prisoners died. I mean, the life expectancy in Mittelbau-Dora was very, very low. But it was important for the production of the missiles. And so the SS decided to build a brothel there. Now, in Mittelbau-Dora, other than in Buchenwald, the communists did not have anything to say in the camp administration. Were not in high position because they're mostly prisoners who were so-called anti-socials or criminals who were in those positions, and they were sometimes very horrible people. But in that case, there was no danger to talk about the subject of the camp brothel. Because then now in the East German history books and even through tours, they would actually talk about this. They would, explain how the brothel was built to increase the productivity and for the missile production. So that was kind of another level of evilness of the Nazis, and sexual violence as part of the atrocities the Nazis committed. Now you can see, they're two-way. It's not black and white. It's not really, you think, the communists would never talk about this subject. They didn't talk about it when it didn't fit into their narrative. In West Germany, the subject was also ignored for many years because it was kind of hard to talk about. It was too complex. Now, finally, in the 1990s, the subject is known. And finally, there's also a little memorial plaque at the brothel of Buchenwald, at the site of the former brothel. And the story also is now talked about in books, and the guides talk about this and so on. So it's included into the narrative of Buchenwald. Thank you very much.